Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. The steady drone of my truck's engine had been my only companion for the past 12 hours. Interstate 87 stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the heart of Texas. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m., and my eyelids were getting heavier with each passing mile. I knew I needed to stop soon. Pushing through the exhaustion wasn't worth the risk. When I spotted the sign for Walker's Rest Stop, I took it as a sign from whatever deity watches over tired truckers. The parking lot was almost empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. As I pulled into one of the oversized spots, the beam of my headlights caught something unusual. A cluster of missing person posters plastered on the bulletin board near the restrooms. In my 15 years of driving this route, I'd seen my share of those posters, but something about their number sent a chill down my spine. I killed the engine, and the darkness rushed in like a flood, broken only by the dim, flickering lights of the rest stop. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket. Stepping down from the cab into the crisp October air, the gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the small seating area. The metal benches were cold and uninviting, but I needed to stretch my legs before attempting sleep. That's when I saw it. A leather-bound notebook wedged between the bench and its concrete base. It looked old, its edges worn smooth by time and handling. I should have left it there. God knows I should have just walked away. The first few pages were filled with neat, methodical handwriting, dated March 15th, 1984. To whoever finds this journal, it began, "I need you to understand what happens here." I told myself I was just curious, that I'd read a few pages before turning it in to the lost and found in the morning. The writer, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, described stopping at this very rest area late one night. She wrote about strange lights in the woods, about whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The next entry was different, another person's handwriting. More recent, dated 1992, then another from 2001, 2008, 2015. Each entry telling a similar story of stopping here late at night, finding the journal, reading the previous entries, and each writer disappeared after making their contribution. I know this because some entries were unfinished, ending mid-sentence. Others were followed by newspaper clippings about missing persons tucked carefully between the pages. My hands were shaking as I reached the final entry. Dated just 3 months ago, the writer described exactly what I was experiencing now. Finding the journal, reading the entries, feeling the growing sense of dread. As I read, the rest stop's lights began to flicker more intensely, and I could have sworn I heard something moving in the darkness beyond the parking lot. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that had been waiting for the journal's next reader. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the lack of sleep was making me paranoid. But as I sat there with the journal in my trembling hands, the sounds from the woods grew more distinct, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But not in the random way nature moves. These sounds were deliberate, methodical, like something was pacing the tree line. Watching me, I shined my flashlight toward the woods, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by an unnatural darkness. The journal's weight in my hands felt heavier with each passing minute. I couldn't stop reading, even as my instincts screamed at me to run. The entries began to reveal patterns I hadn't noticed before. Every disappearance occurred on nights when the moon was exactly as it was now, a thin crescent, barely visible through the scattered clouds, and every victim had reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the rest stop, symbols that I could now see clearly illuminated by my flashlight's beam. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the rest area, carrying with it the sound of distant voices. They weren't speaking English, or any language I'd ever heard before. The voices seemed to be chanting, their words creating patterns that made my head spin. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the journal to my chest. And that's when I saw them. Dark figures standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible against the trees. They didn't move, didn't seem to breathe, just stood there watching. The temperature dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. The rest stop's lights were now pulsing in rhythm with the distant chanting, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance and twist in impossible ways. I tried to run back to my truck, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The air itself seemed to have become thick and resistant, as if reality was breaking down around me. The journal's pages began to turn on their own, flipping rapidly until they stopped on an entry I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was erratic, desperate, and the words seemed to crawl across the page like living things. "They're coming," it read. "They always come when someone reads their stories. They need our stories, our experiences, our fear. They've been collecting them for centuries, and now you're part of their collection too." My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into near total darkness. In that moment, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo with an impossible depth. I wanted to turn around, to face whatever was coming, but my body wouldn't respond. The voices in the woods grew louder, and I realized with horror that I could suddenly understand what they were saying. They were calling my name, but not the name I use now. They were calling me by names I had in other lives, other times. Names I somehow recognized despite never having heard them before. The world around me had become a nightmare, but the journal demanded to be read. My fingers moved across its pages with a will of their own, revealing entries that seemed to write themselves before my eyes. The paper felt warm, almost alive, and I discovered a section that appeared to be written in Latin. The text described an ancient sect called Custodes Temporis, the keepers of time, who had inhabited this land long before Texas was settled. Through tears of terror, I read about their beliefs, that certain places in the world served as nexus points. Where the barriers between different times and realities grew thin, this rest stop wasn't built here by accident. The keepers had chosen this spot centuries ago, creating a ritual site that would later be paved over but never truly destroyed. The missing persons weren't just disappearing, they were being harvested. Their experiences and memories collected like precious gems. The journal itself was their tool, a carefully crafted artifact designed to lure travelers into their trap. Each person who found it added their own story, their own fear and confusion, strengthening its power. The entries weren't just records, they were components of an elaborate ritual that had been ongoing for hundreds of years. And now I realized with growing horror, I wasn't just reading these accounts, I was becoming part of them. My surroundings began to shift and change. The modern rest stop facilities flickered like a faulty hologram, revealing glimpses of what had stood here before. Stone circles, wooden totems, and altars stained dark with ancient sacrifices. The voices in the woods had grown into a chorus, and I could see figures moving between the trees, some dressed in modern clothes, others in historical garments, and still others in robes that seemed to absorb light itself. Time itself seemed to be breaking down around me. I saw other versions of myself, past and future iterations, all drawn to this place, all finding the journal, all becoming part of its endless cycle. Some of these versions noticed me and reached out with desperate hands, their mouths moving in silent warnings. I wanted to run, but every direction I turned showed me another version of this cursed place in another time. The keepers had created something far more terrifying than a simple haunted location. They had built a trap that transcended time itself, capturing souls across centuries, collecting experiences that would fuel their dark rituals. And as I stood there, witnessing the layers of reality peel away like old wallpaper, I realized that every person who had ever disappeared here was still present, their consciousness trapped in an eternal moment, their stories feeding the power of this place. The journal's pages were now moving on their own, fluttering rapidly as if caught in a violent wind, though the air around me remained deathly still. Images began forming on the pages, not written words, but actual moving pictures showing scenes from different times. I saw myself arriving at the rest stop, over and over again, in countless variations. In some, I drove different trucks. In others, I arrived in cars from different decades. Each version of me found the journal. Each began to read, and each became trapped in this nightmare. Reality continued to fracture around me. The modern rest stop was now completely gone, replaced by a kaleidoscope of different time periods all occupying the same space. I watched as Native Americans performed rituals on this very spot centuries ago, their ceremonies overlapping with colonial settlers building their first structures, which merged with construction workers laying the foundation for the rest stop, all happening simultaneously, all equally real and present. The figures in robes, the keepers, were moving closer now, emerging from the chaos of overlapping time streams. They moved in impossible ways, sometimes appearing to walk backwards through time, sometimes splitting into multiple versions of themselves. Their faces, when visible beneath their hoods, were wrong, like badly developed photographs showing multiple exposures all at once. They were speaking to me in that ancient language again, but now I could understand every word, as if I had always known their tongue. They explained, through voices that echoed across centuries, that this was all part of their grand design. The rest stop, the journal, the disappearances. It was a carefully constructed machine designed to harvest human experiences across time. Each person who stopped here and found the journal added their own unique perspective to the collective, their fears and realizations becoming fuel for something much larger. We weren't just victims. We were components in a vast, supernatural engine. I tried to drop the journal, but it had become part of me, or perhaps I had become part of it. The pages were now showing my own memories, but not just from this life. I saw myself in other times, other places, always somehow finding my way to this cursed spot. The keepers had engineered a temporal loop so perfect that it caught the same souls over and over again, across multiple lifetimes. Each time extracting more of their essence, the knowledge hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just stumbled upon this place by accident. I'd been drawn here, just as I had been in countless past lives, and just as I would be in countless future ones. The exhaustion that had led me to stop here wasn't natural. It was the journal's call, reaching across time and space, guiding me back to this moment of revelation, and somewhere, in other times and other realities, infinite versions of me were experiencing this same horrific enlightenment. The keepers surrounded me now, their robes rippling with movements that defied physics. In their presence, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The journal in my hands had transformed, its pages now transparent like sheets of crystal, showing not just words and images, but entire realities playing out within its depths. And in every single one of these realities, I saw myself trapped in this eternal moment of understanding. Through the crystalline pages, I witnessed the true scope of their design. The rest stop wasn't just a place. It was a node in a vast network of similar locations across the world, each one a carefully positioned trap collecting human experiences throughout history. The keepers had created this network eons ago, patiently waiting as humanity built roads and cities over their sacred sites, knowing that travelers would eventually be drawn to these points of convergence. The voices of all who had been captured here began to speak through me. Truck drivers, families on vacation, lost souls seeking shelter from storms, both literal and metaphorical. Each of us had added our own unique thread to this tapestry of terror. But we weren't just victims or witnesses. We were participants in something far more profound. The keepers hadn't been collecting our stories simply to torture us. They had been preparing us. As this realization dawned, my consciousness expanded beyond the confines of my current existence. I could feel myself spread across multiple timelines, experiencing countless variations of this moment. In some, I ran. In others, I fought. In still others, I surrendered. But in every single version, I came to understand the same terrible truth. The keepers weren't our enemies. They were our future selves, reaching backward through time to ensure their own creation. The journal's final pages revealed the ultimate purpose of this temporal trap. Humanity was approaching a crucial moment in its evolution, a point where we would either transcend the limitations of linear time or fade into extinction. The keepers had found a way to guide our species toward transcendence. but it required an impossible paradox. They needed to create themselves by collecting and preserving human consciousness across all of history. As the last page turned, I felt my own consciousness beginning to fragment and expand. The terror that had gripped me transformed into a kind of ecstatic understanding. I was becoming one of them, or rather, I always had been one of them, just as every person who had ever found this journal was part of this grand metamorphosis. The rest, stop, the journal, the fear and confusion. It was all a chrysalis, a transformative chamber where human consciousness could evolve beyond the bonds of linear existence. And as I accepted this truth, I felt myself begin to change. My awareness spreading across time itself, becoming one with the very forces that had trapped me here. The moment I pulled up to 1887 Blackwood Drive, something felt off about the property. As a realtor with 15 years of experience in Massachusetts's historic homes, I'd developed a sixth sense about places, and this Victorian mansion was screaming at my instincts to turn around and drive away. But the commission on a $7 million listing wasn't something I could ignore, especially not with my daughter's college tuition looming on the horizon. The key stuck in the ancient lock, requiring a forceful jiggle before the heavy oak door creaked open. The musty scent of decades of abandonment assaulted my nostrils, along with something else. A sickly sweet undertone that reminded me of overripe fruit left too long in summer heat. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as I made my way through the foyer, my camera ready to capture the property's charming historical features, as my listing would inevitably describe them. The grand staircase dominated the entrance, its mahogany banister still gleaming despite years of neglect. As I raised my camera to photograph it, something caught my eye. A wall of photographs stretching up to the second floor. Dozens of black and white images, some daguerreotypes so old their silver surfaces had almost completely tarnished. Others, more recent Polaroids from the 1970s, all arranged in a perfect chronological spiral. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, studying each image in turn. The same woman appeared in every single one, a striking beauty with high cheekbones and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light. In the oldest photo, dated 1840, she stood in a formal Victorian dress. In another from 1923, she wore a flapper's beaded dress. A color photo from 1968 showed her in a miniskirt. Different eras, different clothes, but the same unchanged face, the same unaging eyes. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 20 degrees as I backed away from the wall. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe they were different women, family members who just happened to look alike, but I knew that wasn't true. The resemblance was too perfect, too exact. As I turned to leave, my camera slipped from suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the floor. In the silence that followed, I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the second floor. I told myself it was just the house settling, an old building's natural noises. But then I saw my reflection in the glass of one of the photographs, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn my face was already there, captured in an antique frame, staring back at me with those same dark, ageless eyes. The worst part wasn't the impossibility of what I was seeing. It was the small date written beneath the image, 2025. I spent the entire weekend digging through local archives, my hands trembling as I scrolled through microfiche records and dusty deed registries. The house had been sold 14 times since its construction in 1840, each sale following the same pattern, a mysterious woman purchasing the property, living there alone for exactly 5 years, then disappearing without a trace. The new owner would always arrive within days of the disappearance, looking identical to the last. The town's historical society yielded more disturbing details. Every owner had been a successful businesswoman, each one vanishing at the height of their career. Local newspapers documented the investigations, 14 women, 14 unsolved cases. The most recent disappearance was in 1985, after which the house had remained empty until now, until the current owner had hired me, communicating only through emails and legal representatives. As I dug deeper, patterns emerged that made my blood run cold. Each disappearance had occurred during a lunar eclipse. Each woman had been described as increasingly reclusive in the weeks before vanishing, speaking of strange reflections and photographs that seemed to move. And each had reported seeing their own face in the historical photos before they disappeared. Just like I had, I checked my phone. The next lunar eclipse was in 3 weeks. The library's ancient computer chimed with an incoming email. It was from the owner, the first direct communication I'd received. The message contained just one line. "The house has chosen you, Sarah, as it chose me, as it chose all of us." The sender's name made my heart stop. It matched the name of the woman who had built the house in 1840. The timestamp showed it had been sent in 1985. I drove back to the house that evening, armed with a digital camera and a determination to prove I was imagining things. The front door was unlocked, though I distinctly remembered securing it during my last visit. Inside, the wall of photographs had changed. New spaces had appeared between the frames, empty spaces waiting to be filled, and in the center of the spiral, a modern digital camera lay on a small table, identical to the one I'd dropped and broken days before. The camera's display screen flickered to life as I approached, showing the last image taken. It was a photo of me, standing in the foyer, looking at the wall of photographs. But I hadn't taken this picture. It had been taken from behind me, from the top of the stairs, and in the reflection of one of the framed photos, I could clearly see who had taken it. A woman with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to absorb all light. Wearing clothes from another century, the photographs began appearing in my own home. First in my dreams, then in reality. I'd wake to find vintage portraits on my bedroom wall, my face staring back at me from eras I'd never lived through. When I tried to remove them, they'd reappear in different places, the frames growing older, the images showing me in increasingly antiquated settings. My daughter asked why I was hanging up old photos of her grandmother. She saw a family resemblance I knew couldn't exist. Every mirror became a portal to terror. My reflection would remain for seconds after I stepped away, sometimes wearing clothes from different periods, sometimes moving independently of me. I started covering all reflective surfaces in my house, but it only made things worse. The images would appear in windows, in the screen of my phone, in the chrome finish of my coffee maker. Each reflection showed me aging backwards, becoming the woman I'd seen in those first photographs at the house. The house's pull grew stronger with each passing day. I'd find myself driving there without meaning to, walking up to the front door before catching myself. The windows seemed to watch me as I sat in my car across the street, trying to understand what was happening. Inside, lights would flicker in patterns, and sometimes just at sunset, I could see a figure moving from window to window, wearing dresses from different centuries as she passed each pane of glass. Research into the house's origins led me to a hidden collection of documents in the university's restricted archives. The original owner, Elizabeth Blackwood, had been obsessed with immortality. The blueprints for the house revealed it wasn't built like a normal home. The walls were lined with mirrors behind the plaster, arranged in geometric patterns that formed impossible angles. Equations and symbols were scrawled in the margins, calculations for trapping light. And something else, the lunar eclipse was now just days away, and my appearance had begun to change. My colleagues commented on how young I looked, how my eyes seemed darker. In photographs, my face was becoming harder to capture, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on my features. The house's previous owners had all gone through the same transformation, their driver's license photos showing a gradual shift until they matched the ageless woman in the historical pictures. During my last visit to the Historical Society, I found a journal hidden inside a hollow book. It was written by Elizabeth Blackwood herself, and as I read it, my hands shook so badly I could barely turn the pages. She described the house as a trap, a device designed to capture not just light and reflections, but time itself. Each new owner was needed to power the cycle, their youth and vitality feeding the eternal engine she had built. The photos weren't documentation, they were batteries, storing fragments of stolen time. The answers I discovered in Elizabeth's journal made me wish I'd remained ignorant. The house wasn't just a building, it was a machine, designed to harvest time itself. Each photograph on its walls contained a fragment of a soul, preserved in silver and light. The women hadn't disappeared, they had been absorbed, their essence used to maintain Elizabeth's immortality. We weren't separate victims. We were all becoming her. Pieces of ourselves slowly replacing pieces of her that had worn thin over centuries. My attempts to escape proved futile. I tried leaving town, but every road somehow led back to Blackwood Drive. I bought plane tickets, only to find myself driving to the house instead of the airport. The photos in my wallet changed every time I opened it, showing me in different eras, different lives. My reflection grew increasingly unstable, sometimes showing Elizabeth's face instead of my own, sometimes showing nothing at all. The line between us was blurring, and I could feel her memory seeping into my dreams. The ritual, according to Elizabeth's writings, required specific alignments. The lunar eclipse was crucial, a moment when light itself became unstable. When the barriers between times grew thin, the house's mirror-lined walls would focus these energies, using them to transfer another fragment of my essence into the eternal cycle. Each previous owner had contributed their part, their youth and vitality feeding the endless hunger of Elizabeth's immortality machine. But this time, something was different. This time, I could feel the pattern weakening. Through Elizabeth's encroaching memories, I discovered a terrible truth. The cycle was failing. Each transfer had been less successful than the last. The captured essences degrading faster, requiring more frequent replacements. Elizabeth's original calculations had been flawed. The house wasn't creating immortality, it was postponing an inevitable collapse. And when that collapse came, it wouldn't just kill her. It would unravel every woman who had ever been absorbed into her eternal pattern. My research led me to a hidden room in the house's basement, where the true heart of Elizabeth's machine lay exposed. Mirrors arranged in impossible geometries reflected endlessly into each other, creating depths that hurt to look at. In their surfaces, I could see every woman the house had ever taken, their faces overlapping, their memories bleeding together. At the center stood an ornate silver mirror, its frame inscribed with equations and symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The eclipse was tomorrow, and I could feel the house's hunger growing. The photographs on the walls vibrated with anticipation, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Elizabeth's presence in my mind grew stronger, her memories threatening to overwhelm my own. But as her thoughts invaded mine, I gained access to her knowledge, including the one thing she had never intended any of her replacements to discover: how to break the cycle. The question was whether I could act on this knowledge before I lost myself completely, before I became just another photograph on the wall, watching through silver eyes as the next victim was drawn into the eternal cycle. The eclipse began at exactly 3:47 p.m., and I felt the change immediately. The house came alive around me, its walls humming with accumulated power. Every photograph began to glow with an inner light, and in their surfaces, I could see faces moving, watching. All the women who had come before me, their essences trapped in this eternal prison. Elizabeth's presence in my mind was now a scream, demanding that I complete the ritual, take my place in the cycle, surrender to the endless pattern. I made my way to the basement room, following the knowledge I'd stolen from Elizabeth's memories. The mirror arrays pulsed with energy, each reflection containing centuries of captured time. But now I could see what Elizabeth had missed in her obsession with immortality, the flaws in her equations, the instabilities in her grand design. The house hadn't created eternal life, it had created a temporal loop, feeding on itself, growing weaker with each cycle, and I knew how to break it. The ritual required blood. It always had. But Elizabeth had used it wrong, using it to bind each new victim to the cycle. As the eclipse reached its peak, I approached the central mirror, its surface writhing with captured souls. I could see my own reflection changing, shifting between my face and Elizabeth's, between past and present, between all the women who had been trapped here. The house's power reached its crescendo, ready to absorb me as it had absorbed all the others. Instead of surrendering to the pull, I struck the mirror with my blood-stained hand, completing a different circuit. The equations Elizabeth had carved into the frame began to change, responding to the new pattern I created. The house shuddered, its timeless energy suddenly flowing in reverse. In the mirrors, I saw Elizabeth's face contort with rage and fear as she realized what I had done. I hadn't broken the cycle, I had inverted it. The photographs on the walls began to shatter, one by one, each breaking, releasing a captured soul. The house's architecture twisted as centuries of stored time tried to unwind all at once. Through the chaos, I could see them. All the women Elizabeth had sacrificed, their forms becoming solid again as they were pulled free from their silver prisons. My own face stabilized in the remaining mirrors, no longer shifting between identities as Elizabeth's hold over me broke. The final explosion of light coincided with the end of the eclipse. When my vision cleared, I stood alone in an empty basement. The mirrors were gone, the photographs destroyed, the walls now just walls. But in my hand I held a single daguerreotype that had survived. The original image of Elizabeth Blackwood, no longer eternal, no longer young, just a photograph of a woman from 1840. Her dark eyes no longer able to hold my gaze. Her secrets finally laid to rest. As I climbed the stairs to leave, I saw my reflection in a broken shard of mirror. My own face, my own eyes, my own time restored. The house on Blackwood Drive stood quiet behind me, its hunger finally satisfied, its collection of eternal portraits reduced to dust and memory. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I settled into my chair in the security office of Evergreen Mall, beginning another mundane night shift. The monitors before me displayed their usual feeds: empty corridors, darkened storefronts, and the occasional shadow cast by swaying trees outside. I'd been working here for 6 months now, and the quiet solitude had become almost comforting. That was until I saw her for the first time. A small figure, no more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing what appeared to be a white dress, standing motionless in front of Claire's boutique on the second floor. My heart nearly stopped when I first spotted her on camera 23. It wasn't uncommon for kids to hide from their parents during shopping hours, but the mall had closed 3 hours ago. I immediately grabbed my flashlight and radio, rushing toward the escalators. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as I took the steps 2 at a time. When I reached Claire's, there was nothing, just the usual mannequins casting eerie shadows through the storefront glass. I did a complete sweep of the second floor, checking every possible hiding spot, but found no trace of anyone. Back in the security office, I rewound the footage, my hands trembling slightly as I manipulated the controls. There she was again, clear as day, standing perfectly still for exactly 47 seconds before simply vanishing into thin air. I replayed the footage multiple times, scrutinizing every frame. There was no glitch, no camera malfunction. She was there, and then she wasn't. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, a reflection perhaps, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The rest of that first night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me as I prepared to leave at dawn. I made a final check of the cameras. That's when I saw her again, this time in the food court. Sitting alone at one of the tables, I didn't bother running to check this time. Instead, I watched as she slowly turned her head toward the camera, and though the image was grainy, I could have sworn she smiled directly at me. When she raised her hand to wave, I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The morning sun was beginning to peek through the windows when I finally left the security office, my mind racing with questions. I'd worked plenty of night shifts before, but nothing had prepared me for this. As I walked through the parking lot to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just before getting in, I glanced back at the mall's facade, and there, in a second-floor window, I saw a small hand press against the glass. By the time I blinked, it was gone. The drive home was a blur of paranoid glances in my rearview mirror and attempts to rationalize what I'd witnessed. I tried telling myself that lack of sleep was playing tricks on my mind, that the long hours of solitude were finally getting to me. But as I lay in bed that morning, trying unsuccessfully to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about that little girl's smile. Something about it seemed familiar, as if I'd seen it before, long ago. It wasn't until I was finally drifting off that I remembered. She looked exactly like the girl from the missing persons poster I'd seen in the mall's storage room during my orientation. I spent my day off researching the mall's history, unable to shake the image of that girl from my mind. The Evergreen Mall had opened in 1985, replacing an old-growth forest that local tribes had once considered sacred ground. As I dug deeper into newspaper archives at the local library, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Over the past 3 decades, there had been multiple reports of strange occurrences after hours. Unexplained noises, items moving on their own, and most disturbingly, several accounts of a young girl seen wandering the corridors. That night, I returned to work with a digital camera and a voice recorder. Determined to document any unusual activity, the first few hours passed without incident, but around 2 a.m., the temperature in the security office suddenly plummeted. I watched in disbelief as my breath began to fog in the air. The monitors flickered simultaneously, and when they stabilized, she was there again, this time standing in the center of the main corridor, her white dress swaying slightly as if caught in a non-existent breeze. The voice recorder on my desk suddenly crackled to life, emitting a burst of static followed by what sounded like a child's laughter. I fumbled with my camera, hands shaking as I tried to capture what I was seeing on the monitors. But when I reviewed the photos later, they showed only empty corridors. The audio recording, however, contained something that made my blood run cold. A small voice barely audible through the static saying, "Remember me, Michael. You promised you'd find me." I hadn't told anyone at the mall my first name. I went by Mike on my name tag and in all my paperwork. As this realization hit me, the lights in the security office began to flicker. One by one, the monitors went dark, then lit up again, showing the same image on every screen. The little girl, much closer now, her face inches from the cameras, her eyes, which I had never been able to see clearly before, were completely black, like empty sockets staring directly into my soul. The next few hours became a twisted game of cat and mouse. Every time I saw her on one monitor and rushed to investigate, she would appear on another, always just out of reach. The voice recorder continued to pick up fragments of whispered conversations and distant laughter. At one point, I heard what sounded like my own voice, much younger, making a promise I couldn't quite remember. The digital temperature display on the wall kept dropping, eventually showing impossible negative numbers before shorting out completely. As dawn approached, I made one final sweep of the mall. In the food court, I found something that hadn't been there before. A child's drawing done in crayon on one of the tables. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, standing in front of what looked like trees. The tall figure had been violently scribbled out in black crayon. On the back was written a single word in childish handwriting: "Remember." The paper felt damp to the touch, as if it had been recently drawn, but there was no sign of any crayons nearby. The revelation came during my 3rd week on nights, as I was reviewing old security footage from the mall's archives. I'd started going back through years of recordings, searching for any sign of the girl, when I stumbled upon something strange. In footage from 1986, just a year after the mall opened, I saw myself as a young boy, no more than 10 years old, playing hide and seek with a little girl in a white dress. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m. Well, after closing time, how was I there? Why couldn't I remember this? The footage showed us running through the empty corridors, laughing and ducking behind planters. I watched, transfixed, as my younger self followed the girl into the service corridor behind the food court, an area that had been sealed off years ago during renovations. The camera feed ended abruptly after that, cutting to static. My hands trembled as I ejected the tape, finding a label I hadn't noticed before: Evidence, Case 847B, Missing Child Investigation. Memories began flooding back, fragments of a night I'd apparently buried deep in my subconscious. My father had been the mall's head of security back then. He would sometimes bring me to work with him on night shifts when my mother was working late at the hospital. That night, I'd met Sarah, the daughter of one of the cleaning staff. We'd played together while our parents worked, but something had gone wrong. something I'd spent decades trying to forget. I pulled out my phone and searched for news articles from that period. There it was. Local girl disappears during mall construction. Sarah Matthews, age 8, had vanished without a trace while playing with the security guard's son. The article mentioned that parts of the old service corridor had collapsed that night due to unstable ground, a result of rushing the mall's construction. Despite warnings about the land's geological instability, the search had lasted weeks, but no body was ever found. The guilt hit me like a physical blow as more memories surfaced. We'd been exploring the service corridor, even though we knew it was off limits. I dared her to go deeper into the darkness, telling her there was supposed to be an old tribal burial ground under the mall. She'd been scared, but I'd promised to protect her. I'd promised I wouldn't leave her alone. But when the walls started creaking and dirt began falling from the ceiling, I'd run. I'd left her behind. My father had found me hours later, huddled in the security office, too terrified to speak. In the days that followed, as rescue teams searched the collapsed corridor, I'd convinced myself it was just a nightmare. My parents had moved us to another state shortly after, and over time, I'd suppressed the entire incident now. 30 years later, I'd taken a job at the same mall without consciously remembering any of it. But Sarah had remembered. She'd been waiting all this time for me to remember too. The security office suddenly felt suffocating as I sat there, grappling with the weight of my recovered memories. The monitors began to flicker again. This time, when they stabilized, they showed the sealed entrance to the old service corridor. Standing in front of it was Sarah, but not as the innocent child from my memories. Her white dress was now stained with dirt and what looked like blood, her skin pale and grey, her black eyes fixed on the camera. She raised her hand, beckoning me to follow, just as she had that night 3 decades ago. I found myself standing in front of the sealed entrance to the service corridor, my flashlight beam trembling against the plywood barrier. The maintenance records I'd discovered revealed something disturbing. The collapse that night hadn't been due to natural instability. The construction company had cut corners, building directly over a series of Native American burial chambers. Despite numerous warnings, they'd simply poured concrete over them and hoped for the best. The weight of the mall's foundation had eventually caused the chambers to cave in, using a crowbar from the maintenance room. I began prying at the plywood. Each crack of splintering wood echoed through the empty corridor like a gunshot. Behind the barrier, I found the original service door, its metal surface covered in rust and warning signs. The handle turned with a grinding screech that set my teeth on edge as the door swung open. A blast of stale, earthen air hit my face, carrying with it the musty smell of decay and something else. Something ancient and wrong. My flashlight beam revealed a narrow corridor stretching into darkness, its walls covered in decades of grime and water damage. The floor sloped downward at a steep angle, disappearing into the earth beneath the mall. As I took my first step inside, I heard a child's giggle echo from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. "I remember now. I'm sorry I left you. I'm here to make it right." The only response was another giggle. Further down the corridor, the passage grew narrower as I descended, the ceiling lower, forcing me to crouch. The walls were no longer finished concrete, but rough-hewn earth and stone. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of what looked like ancient symbols carved into the rock, their edges worn smooth by time. I recognized some of them from my research, tribal warnings about disturbed spirits and sacred ground. The air grew thicker, filled with dancing motes of dust that seemed to move against the air currents, swirling in patterns that made my eyes hurt. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and my flashlight beam revealed something that made my heart stop. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be burial remnants, fragments of bone, deteriorated ceremonial objects, and faded pictographs. But it was the center of the chamber that drew my attention. There, half buried in the dirt floor, was a small skeleton wearing the tattered remains of what had once been a white dress. Around its neck was a silver locket, the same one I remembered Sarah wearing the night she disappeared. As I approached the skeleton, my flashlight began to flicker and die. In the growing darkness, I heard movement behind me, Accompanied by the sound of bare feet on dirt, a small, cold hand slipped into mine, just as it had 30 years ago. "You came back," Sarah's voice whispered, but there was something wrong with it, something else speaking beneath her words, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting in this place long before the mall was built. "Now you can stay with me forever, just like you promised." The security cameras throughout the mall recorded everything that happened next. Though no one would believe the footage was real, the timestamp showed 3:33 a.m. when every monitor in the security office suddenly came to life, displaying views of the sealed service corridor. The infrared sensors detected 2 heat signatures moving through the tunnel, one adult-sized, one child-sized, though only one set of footprints appeared in the dust. What the cameras captured in the burial chamber defied explanation. As my flashlight died, the infrared feed showed multiple heat signatures emerging from the walls, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They surrounded my figure and the smaller heat signature that had been Sarah. The temperature in the chamber dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the camera lens. The audio feed picked up sounds that the forensics team would later spend months analyzing. Whispers in long-dead languages, the crying of children, and beneath it all, a deep thrumming that made the cameras vibrate. In the last clear frame, my face is visible as I turn toward the camera. My expression is one of dawning horror as I finally understand the truth. Sarah wasn't the only child who had been lost in this place. The sacred ground beneath the mall had been a burial site for centuries, where the tribes had laid to rest those taken before their time. The building of the mall had disturbed something ancient and patient, something that had been collecting lost children long before Sarah and would continue long after. The next few minutes of footage show chaos, shadows moving against shadows, the ceiling beginning to crack, and the temperature dropping low enough to cause the cameras to malfunction. Through the static and interference, brief glimpses are visible. My body being lifted off the ground, Sarah's figure dissipating into a swarm of darker shapes, and the walls of the chamber appearing to breathe. The final frame shows the burial chamber collapsing in on itself, taking everything inside with it. When the mall opened the next morning, they found the service corridor sealed more thoroughly than ever, with no sign that it had been opened. The only evidence of what transpired was found in the security office. The bank of monitors still displaying snow and static, and a single crayon drawing left on the desk. It showed a group of children holding hands in a circle, standing among trees. One of them wore a security guard's uniform, and at the bottom was written in childish handwriting, "Now you're all safe with us." The official report listed Michael Henderson as missing. Presumed dead in a structural collapse, the mall eventually reopened, albeit with new security cameras and a different night guard. But sometimes on quiet nights, the cameras still catch glimpses of children playing in the empty corridors after closing. A small girl in a white dress, and now a man in a security uniform, forever keeping his promise to never leave her alone again. And if you listen carefully near the sealed corridor, you might hear the sound of children laughing, echoing up from deep beneath the foundations of the evergreen mall, where ancient spirits continue their patient vigil over those who were lost too soon. I've been driving for what feels like an eternity through the Nevada desert, the kind of drive where the white lines on the road start to hypnotize you, and the darkness seems to press against your windshield like a living thing. The radio stopped picking up signals about an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but the hum of my Honda's engine and the occasional rattle of my nearly empty coffee cup in the holder. It's just past midnight, and the moonlight casts strange shadows across the desert landscape, making the Joshua trees look like twisted figures reaching toward the star-filled sky. My phone screen suddenly illuminates the car interior with its harsh blue glow, making me jump slightly in my seat. A text message notification. Nothing unusual about that except my phone's been in airplane mode for the last 3 hours to conserve battery. I glance down at the screen, my heart beginning to race as I see my own number staring back at me. That's impossible. The message preview shows 3 words that make my blood run cold. Don't stop ahead. The gas gauge needle hovers just above empty, a warning light blinking steadily on my dashboard. I've been watching it for the past 20 miles, knowing there's supposed to be a gas station coming up soon. According to my GPS, it's the last one for another 100 miles. My palms are sweaty against the steering wheel as I debate whether to read the full message. Common sense says it's impossible to receive a text from yourself, let alone when your phone's in airplane mode. But there it is, sitting in my message thread like a spider in the center of its web. With trembling fingers, I pull over to the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching under my tires. The headlights illuminate a weathered mile marker and a tattered billboard advertising the upcoming Gas and Go. 15 miles ahead. I pick up my phone, swipe open the message, and feel my throat constrict as I read the full text. Don't stop at Gas and Go. They've been waiting for you. They know you're coming. Drive past it no matter what. Sarah. My name, my number, warning myself. The desert wind howls outside, making my car rock slightly. I check my gas gauge again. The warning light seems to blink more urgently now, like it knows something I don't. Another text comes through. The last 3 women who stopped there disappeared. Look it up. My fingers move before my brain can process what I'm doing, opening my browser and typing Gas and Go Nevada disappearances into the search bar. The results make my heart stop. 3 unsolved cases in the past year alone, all women traveling alone at night. As I sit there paralyzed with indecision, a 3rd message appears. This one makes me start the engine and slam the car into drive, my tires spitting gravel as I accelerate back onto the highway. They're already watching you through the cameras. They saw you pull over. Whatever you do, don't look at the attendant's face when you drive past. He's not human anymore. Sarah, 3 hours from now. The implications of that timestamp send my mind reeling into darkness deeper than the desert night surrounding me. The messages keep coming now, each one more terrifying than the last. My phone buzzes with clockwork precision every 15 minutes. Each text signed with my name and a timestamp that hasn't happened yet. The latest one shows a timestamp from tomorrow morning, and I can't stop my hands from shaking as I read it. By now, you know why Mom and Dad never talked about the summer of 1999, about what happened to me, to us. Pull over and check the trunk. You need to see what's there. I never told anyone about the gaps in my childhood memories, about that summer that seems to exist only in fragments and nightmares. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia, but my parents would change the subject whenever I asked about those missing months. The highway stretches endlessly before me, a black ribbon cutting through the desert night. The gas gauge warning light blinks with maddening persistence, a steady reminder that I'm running out of options. I've been Googling frantically at every stop, piecing together a pattern that makes less sense. The more I uncover, 3 women disappeared at the Gas and Go this year. Yes, but what the news reports don't mention is that it's happened before. Every 25 years, like clockwork, women vanish on this stretch of highway. The earliest case I can find is from 1949, and the description of the missing woman makes my blood freeze. She could be my twin. Same age, same red hair, same green eyes. The article includes a grainy black and white photo, and I have to pull over again because I can't tell if I'm looking at an old photograph or a mirror. Another message arrives, this one containing GPS coordinates and a cryptic warning. The truth isn't in the gas station. It's half a mile into the desert behind it. That's where they took us. That's where the door is. But you can't go there yet. They're waiting for you to make the same mistake I did. The coordinates lead to a location just off the highway, and satellite images show what looks like an old service road leading into the darkness. My phone's screen flickers, and for a moment, I swear I see my own face looking back at me, but older, scarred with eyes that have seen things I can't comprehend. I've been avoiding the question that's been nagging at the edges of my consciousness since this began. How can I be receiving messages from myself? The rational part of my mind screams that this is impossible, that I'm having some sort of breakdown brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But then another text arrives with a photo attached. A Polaroid I've never seen before, dated 1999, showing a young girl standing in front of the Gas and Go. She's wearing my favorite childhood dress, the one with the sunflowers, and her face is mine. But I have no memory of this photo, of ever being here. The next message is the one that breaks me, that shatters any remaining doubt about the reality of what's happening. The reason you don't remember is because it hasn't happened to you yet. But it happened to me, over and over and over. We're caught in a loop, Sarah. Every 25 years, we come back here trying to break it. I'm you from the last cycle, you're me from the next. But this time, we can end it, pull into the next turnout. I left something there for us 25 years ago. Something that will make you remember. Despite all the warnings, my fuel situation forces me to stop at a small rundown station 30 miles before the gas and go. The flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow over the empty parking lot, and my phone buzzes again. He's safe, this one, for now. But he knows things. Ask him about the woman with the sunflower dress. The attendant is an elderly man with kind eyes and trembling hands, but when I mention the dress, those hands go still and his face turns ashen. "You're one of them," he whispers, his eyes suddenly sharp with recognition. "One of the loop walkers. I've been waiting." He shuffles to the back room without another word, returning with a dusty cardboard box. Inside, I find newspaper clippings dating back to 1949, all documenting the same pattern. Women who look exactly like me, disappearing on this stretch of highway. But it's what's beneath the clippings that makes my breath catch. Dozens of Polaroids, each showing the same woman in different years, different clothes, but always with my face. Some look older, some younger, but all have the same determined expression, the same green eyes. The attendant's voice is barely a whisper as he tells me what he knows. His father worked at the Gas and Go in 1974, witnessed one of the disappearances. "They're not taking different women," he explains, his voice shaking. "It's the same woman over and over. Time isn't straight out here in the desert. It loops back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. And you're caught in the center of it." He shows me a journal, its pages filled with observations spanning decades. Each time you try something different, each time you fail, but you keep leaving yourself clues, trying to break the cycle. The journal entries become increasingly desperate, documenting multiple versions of me attempting different strategies to avoid or confront whatever waits at the Gas and Go. Some versions tried to fight, others to run. A few even attempted to burn the place down. All failed, all disappeared. The attendant points to the final entry, dated just last week. The door only opens at midnight. The key is in the sunflower dress. But it's not about getting through the door. It's about closing it forever. My phone lights up again. But this time it's different. The message shows a video file, and my hands shake as I press play. It shows security camera footage from the Gas and Go, dated 25 years ago. A young girl in a sunflower dress approaches the store at night, then suddenly stops, looking directly at the camera. She holds up a piece of paper with writing too small to read. I zoom in, and the words become clear. The code is 1949. The safe is behind the counter. What's inside will end this. The attendant's eyes fill with tears as he watches the video. I remember her. You, that night, you were so determined. Said you were going to break the loop, but something went wrong. He pauses, struggling with the memory. The cameras caught what happened next, but the footage disappeared, along with you, just like all the others. He reaches under the counter and pulls out one final item, a key on a chain with a sunflower pendant. You left this with my father that night, said to give it to the next you who came asking about the dress. 25 years right on schedule. The key feels impossibly heavy around my neck as I drive towards the Gas and Go, my headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The messages have stopped coming, replaced by an eerie silence that feels more threatening than any warning. I know now why my memories of that summer are fragmented. They haven't happened to this version of me yet, but I remember other things, impossible things like the smell of diesel and fear, the sound of a door creaking open in the desert night, and the feeling of time bending around me like a Mobius strip. The journal entries revealed a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Each cycle, each version of me was slightly different. Some were artists, some were scientists, some were fighters, but all of us shared the same core memory, a childhood trauma we couldn't quite recall. involving a summer vacation that went horribly wrong. The attendant's father had written about it. She keeps coming back, trying to save herself, but you can't change the past without changing the future, and she's both past and future now. The loop feeds on her determination. As I approach the coordinates mentioned in the earlier message, my car's electrical system starts to malfunction. The headlights flicker, the radio turns on by itself, playing snippets of broadcasts from different decades. Through the static, I hear familiar voices, my own voice, from different times, different attempts. The door opens at midnight, one says, but it's not about getting through. Another adds, it's about understanding why it's there. A third voice concludes, the realization hits me like a physical blow. I'm not just hearing recordings, I'm hearing echoes of myself from other loops, other attempts. The truth spills out of my subconscious like water from a broken dam. Summer, 1999, a family vacation gone wrong. A curious 12-year-old girl following strange lights into the desert behind a gas station, a door where no door should be, opening onto a place where time doesn't flow right. I went in, or I will go in, or I've always been going in. The loop isn't a punishment, it's a rescue mission. Every 25 years, an older version of me tries to stop my younger self from opening that door, but in trying to prevent it, we become the very thing that draws our younger self to this place. The gas and go appears on the horizon, its neon signs cutting through the darkness like a warning, but I'm not stopping there. Not yet. I turn onto the service road I saw in the satellite images, driving into the desert until my headlights illuminate something that shouldn't exist. A small girl in a sunflower dress, standing alone in the darkness. She turns to face me, and I see my own childhood face, tear-stained and frightened. But she's not real. She's an echo, a memory, a moment frozen in time. Behind her, barely visible in the darkness, stands a doorframe made of a material that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. My phone comes to life one final time, displaying a message that makes everything click into place. We've been trying to stop it from happening, but that's not why we're here. We're here because it already happened, is happening, will happen. The only way to break the loop is to let it happen. But differently this time, the key isn't for the door in the desert. It's for the safe in the station. Inside is the one thing we've never tried. The truth about what really happened that night, written by the first version of us. The version who started the loop. Standing in the gas and go at midnight, I face my reflection in the security mirror behind the counter. The attendant's face is obscured by shadows, just as the messages warned. But I'm not here for him. The safe opens with a combination I've known all my life without knowing why. 1 to 949. Inside I find a single envelope, yellow with age, addressed to myself. The letter inside, written in my own handwriting, tells the story I've been trying to remember for 25 years. I wasn't the first girl to find the door in the desert. In 1949, another young girl discovered it. My grandmother. She went through but managed to return, changed by whatever she saw on the other side. The door was a temporal anomaly, a crack in reality that showed her every possible version of her future. She spent her life trying to seal it, knowing it would eventually call to her daughter and then to her granddaughter. The sunflower dress wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a marker, a way for her to recognize when the loop was starting again. The truth hits me with stunning clarity. Every version of me who came before wasn't trying to prevent the door from opening. They were trying to prepare me for what I would find on the other side. The disappearances weren't endings, they were attempts. Each version of myself learning a little more, understanding a little more, getting closer to the solution. The loop isn't a trap, it's a training ground. And now, finally, I understand what needs to be done. I drive to the door in the desert, the letter clutched in my hand. The girl in the sunflower dress is there, but this time I see her clearly. Not as a ghost or an echo, but as myself, 25 years ago. She's not running toward the door, she's waiting. She's always been waiting. For this moment, for this version of us to finally understand. The key around my neck isn't for any physical lock. It's a reminder. The sunflower pendant catches the moonlight, and in its reflection, I see every version of myself who has stood in this spot, each one carrying a different piece of the puzzle. Time bends around us as I approach my younger self. The door pulses with an otherworldly energy, but for the first time in any cycle, I'm not afraid of it. The letter explained everything. The door shows you every possible version of your future, but it also shows you how to change it. My grandmother saw this moment, saw every failed attempt, and knew that eventually one version of me would understand that the loop isn't meant to be broken, it's meant to be completed. In every previous cycle, we tried to prevent our younger self from going through the door, but that was never the answer. With trembling hands, I reach out to my younger self, and together we face the door. This time, we'll go through together, past and future united, completing the loop rather than trying to break it. As we step through the threshold, time stops, starts, and realigns itself. The door shimmers and begins to fade, its purpose finally fulfilled. The loop isn't ending, it's evolving, transforming into something new, something whole. And in that moment of transformation, as past and future merge, I finally understand the message I've been sending myself all along. Some doors aren't meant to be closed, they're meant to be walked through with understanding. The gas and go will stand empty now, its dark purpose served. The desert will keep its secrets, and time will flow straight again. But somewhere, in every version of reality, a girl in a sunflower dress will remember this night, not as an ending, but as a beginning. The neon lights of Chicago's downtown flickered against the rain-streaked windshield of my beaten-up Honda Civic as I checked the delivery app one last time. Order number 247, Thai food for a Miss Sarah Chen. Delivery address, 1879 West Industrial Avenue. The navigation showed I was just 5 minutes away, and I couldn't wait to finish this final order and head home. The late February wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the kind of bone-chilling cold that made me question my choice of being a delivery driver in the first place. As I turned onto West Industrial Avenue, something felt off about the neighborhood. The usually bustling industrial district had transformed into a ghost town, with abandoned warehouses looming like silent sentinels in the darkness. The streetlights here seemed dimmer, casting sickly yellow pools that barely penetrated the darkness. My car's headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating crumbling concrete facades and broken windows. Still, the blue dot on my GPS insisted I was heading in the right direction. The building at 1879 emerged from the darkness like a rotting tooth in a decrepit smile. It wasn't the gleaming office complex I had expected, but rather a 15-story monstrosity of rust-stained concrete and shattered windows. The faded letters on the facade read Quantum Dynamics Research, though most of the letters had peeled away, leaving ghostly outlines against the weathered surface. My GPS chimed cheerfully, announcing I had arrived at my destination. But this couldn't be right. This building looked like it hadn't seen a human presence in decades. I pulled into the empty parking lot, gravel crunching under my tires. The order details showed a suite number, 1156, but everything about this scene screamed at me to turn around and cancel the delivery. The rational part of my brain argued that this had to be a mistake. Yet my GPS kept insisting with unwavering certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. As I killed the engine, the silence descended like a heavy blanket, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against metal and glass. Grabbing my phone and the delivery bag, I stepped out into the rain. The security light above the main entrance flickered to life, triggered by my movement, casting harsh shadows across the cracked concrete path leading to the door. That's when I noticed something strange. Despite the building's decrepit exterior, there was a brand new keypad next to the entrance, its blue LED display glowing softly in the darkness. Even more puzzling was the fact that it displayed the current time and date, as if someone had recently installed it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Miss Chen. Please come up. The code is 115679. I stood there, rain soaking through my jacket, staring at those numbers. Every instinct told me to leave, to mark this delivery as impossible and head home. Instead, I found myself punching in the code, each button press feeling like another step past the point of no return. The keypad emitted a soft beep, and the heavy glass door clicked open, releasing a rush of stale air from within. As I stepped inside, the security light behind me flickered once more and went dark, leaving me alone in the building's cavernous lobby, where the beam of my phone's flashlight seemed to be swallowed by shadows that moved just a little too deliberately to be natural. The lobby's marble floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, yet my footprints weren't the only ones visible in the grime. Fresh tracks led toward the elevator bank, their precise outline suggesting they couldn't be more than a few hours old. The building's directory board, hanging crookedly on the wall, was mostly illegible except for one entry that seemed to have been recently wiped clean. Quantum Dynamics Research, Suite 1156, Temporal Engineering Division. The words temporal engineering sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The elevator bank stood like monolithic temples, their brushed steel doors showing no signs of the decay that plagued the rest of the building. When I pressed the call button, it lit up immediately, and I could hear machinery whirring to life somewhere above. The sound echoed through the empty building like an awakening giant. The display above showed the elevator descending from the 11th floor, each number ticking down with deliberate slowness. As I waited, I noticed something odd about my reflection in the polished doors. It seemed to move a fraction of a second after I did, as if experiencing a slight delay. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely out of place in the desolate lobby. The doors slid open silently, revealing an interior that was immaculately clean and well lit, in stark contrast to the decrepit lobby. The walls were covered in mirrors, and as I stepped inside, I caught glimpses of movement in their reflections that didn't correspond to my own when I turned to look directly at them. Everything appeared normal, but in my peripheral vision, the reflections seemed to show different versions of me, some moving slightly faster, others slower, like a video playing at different speeds. As the elevator ascended, I noticed small details that set my nerves on edge. The button panel showed signs of regular use, with the number 11 slightly worn compared to the others. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone and something else I couldn't quite identify, a metallic scent that reminded me of the aftermath of a lightning strike. My phone's screen flickered erratically, the delivery app alternating between showing the current time and impossible timestamps from both the past and future. The gentle hum of the elevator was interrupted by a sudden static burst from my phone, followed by a woman's voice coming through its speaker. "Thank you for bringing my dinner," the voice said, but there was something off about it, as if multiple versions of the same voice were speaking slightly out of sync. Before I could respond, the signal cut out, and my phone displayed dozens of missed calls from numbers that hadn't rung, all from the same customer but with timestamps spanning the last 50 years. When the elevator finally reached the 11th floor, the doors opened to reveal a corridor that defied logic. The hallway stretched out before me, but unlike the lobby's decay, this space appeared to exist in multiple states simultaneously. On the left wall, the paint was fresh and new, while on the right, it peeled and crumbled. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a mesmerizing pattern, each flash revealing a different version of the same corridor, sometimes empty, sometimes filled with busy office workers, sometimes showing glimpses of something darker that my mind refused to fully process. The sound of typing on old keyboards echoed from nowhere and everywhere, accompanied by fragments of conversations that seemed to drift through time itself. Navigating the corridor felt like walking through a dream where reality couldn't quite hold its shape. Suite numbers shifted and changed as I passed them, sometimes showing impossible combinations of digits. The air grew thicker with each step, as if time itself was becoming viscous and resistant to movement. My watch had stopped working, but not in the usual way. The hands spun randomly, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, as if trying to find the correct moment in time to settle on. The Thai food in my delivery bag had gone from steaming hot to ice cold and back again multiple times. The first major revelation hit me when I passed a bulletin board that seemed to phase between different decades in one moment. It displayed current takeout menus and delivery app advertisements. But in the next, it showed newspaper clippings from the 1980s about quantum dynamics breakthrough in temporal displacement technology. The most disturbing article, dated 1985, detailed the mysterious disappearance of 12 researchers after a failed experiment. Among the missing was Dr. Sarah Chen, whose photo matched the profile picture of my current delivery customer. The article flickered and vanished before my eyes, replaced by modern pizza delivery flyers. A door-marked server room stood ajar, spilling harsh blue light into the corridor. Inside, rows of servers hummed with life, their LED displays showing strings of coordinates that I realized weren't marking physical space, but temporal locations on a dusty monitor. A security camera feed played in an endless loop, showing the same group of scientists entering Suite 1156 again and again, but never leaving. Each replay showed subtle differences. Sometimes they carried different equipment, sometimes wore different clothes, as if I was watching multiple timelines simultaneously. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with temporal energy, rippling like heat waves off hot asphalt. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and I began to notice other delivery drivers, ghostly images of people who, like me, had been drawn into this temporal maze. Some looked contemporary, others wore uniforms from decades past. All of them clutched different variations of the same delivery order. All heading towards Suite 1156, I watched in horror as one figure, dressed in a 1990s pizza delivery uniform, walked through a wall as if it wasn't there, leaving behind only a fading echo of his presence. The true nature of what was happening began to crystallize in my mind when I found a logbook in an abandoned security desk. The entries, spanning decades, all described the same pattern. Food deliveries ordered to Suite 1156, drivers who entered but never left, and timestamps that made no logical sense. Some entries were dated in the future, written in hands trembling with fear. One entry, dated tomorrow, was written in my own handwriting, describing the very moment I was currently experiencing. The ink was still wet. As I approached Suite 1156, the corridor began to fragment like a broken mirror, each shard reflecting a different time period. Through one fragment, I saw the building in its prime, bustling with activity. Through another, I witnessed its abandonment. But most disturbing were the fragments showing possible futures. Versions where the building had been demolished, versions where it had become something else entirely, and versions where it stood as an eternal monument to a temporal catastrophe that had yet to occur. The door to Suite 1156 existed in all these realities simultaneously. And as I reached for the handle, I could see my own hand multiplying into dozens of versions, each making the same motion across different timelines. Suite 1156 was both a laboratory and a prison, trapped in a perpetual state of temporal flux. The moment I stepped inside, I understood why my GPS had been so insistent about the location. The room existed in all possible times at once, anchored to this specific point in space-time like a nail piercing through layers of reality. Computer screens lined the walls, each displaying data from different time periods, creating a bizarre technological chronicle of the building's history. In the center of the room stood what appeared to be a quantum mainframe, its surfaces reflecting impossible geometries. Dr. Sarah Chen, or rather, versions of her, occupied the space like a living hologram. She sat at her desk in endless iterations, sometimes young and enthusiastic, sometimes older and haunted, sometimes just a flickering shadow of consciousness. The various versions spoke simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of temporal echoes. "You've brought my dinner," they said in unison. But their eyes revealed the truth. They weren't speaking to me, but to every delivery person who had ever entered this room, all of us now part of the same endless moment. The quantum mainframe hummed with increasing intensity as I moved deeper into the room. Displayed on its screens was the horrifying truth. Quantum dynamics hadn't just been researching time travel. They had succeeded in creating a temporal loop, but lost control of it. The experiment had created a pocket of space-time that existed in all moments simultaneously, trapping the research team in an eternal present. but they needed sustenance to continue their existence. Hence the deliveries, ordered across different timelines, drawing in unsuspecting drivers who became part of the temporal anomaly themselves. Documents scattered across the desk revealed the full scope of the tragedy. The team had discovered that linear time was merely an illusion, a comfortable lie we tell ourselves to make sense of existence. Their experiment had shattered that illusion, creating a space where all moments existed simultaneously. But the human mind wasn't equipped to handle such reality, and the researchers had slowly begun to fragment across multiple timelines, their consciousness splintering like light through a prism. The delivery orders were their attempt to maintain connection with the outside world, even as they lost touch with their own temporal continuity. One particular version of Dr. Chen, appearing more solid than the others, approached me with tears in her eyes. She explained that they had been trying to break the loop for what felt like both an eternity and an instant. Each delivery person who entered became another variable in their temporal equation, another potential key to escaping their prison of infinite moments. The food deliveries were never about sustenance. They were attempts to create a stable connection to linear time, using the mundane predictability of food delivery as an anchor point. The room began to pulse with temporal energy as all versions of Dr. Chen focused their attention on me. They had learned from their mistakes, they explained. Each failed attempt had taught them more about the nature of their prison, and they believed they had finally figured out how to break free. But their solution required a sacrifice. Someone from the present to act as a temporal anchor, allowing them to realign with normal time flow. As they spoke, I noticed other delivery drivers emerging from the temporal shadows, their forms twisted and distorted by years or centuries of existing in all moments at once. They reached for me with desperate hands, their voices joining the chorus of Dr. Chen's explanation. The quantum mainframe's hum reached a fever pitch as the truth of my situation became horrifyingly clear. I wasn't chosen randomly. My timeline had the highest probability of success for their escape attempt. The GPS hadn't malfunctioned. It had been precisely calibrated across multiple timelines to ensure I would arrive at exactly the right temporal coordinate. The Thai food in my delivery bag had become a paradoxical object, simultaneously fresh and decades old, its temporal state making it the perfect catalyst for their planned escape. The room began to fragment into temporal shards, each one showing a different possible outcome of this moment. In some, I saw myself joining the ranks of trapped delivery drivers, my form dissolving into the temporal maze. In others, I witnessed the successful collapse of the time loop, but at devastating costs. The various versions of Dr. Chen moved in perfect synchronization now, their combined consciousness focused on implementing their escape plan. They revealed that the building itself had become a temporal engine, powered by the endless loop of deliveries and disappearances. As they initiated their final procedure, the walls of Suite 1156 became transparent, revealing the true nature of the building. It wasn't just 15 stories of office space. It was a temporal labyrinth extending infinitely in all directions through time. Each floor existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, creating a matrix of overlapping realities. The other trapped souls emerged fully now. Delivery drivers from every era, researchers from parallel timelines, even alternative versions of myself who had made different choices. They all moved toward me. Drawn by the possibility of escape, the quantum mainframe's displays showed the cascading effects of their plan. By using my temporal signature as an anchor, they could theoretically collapse all timelines into one coherent reality, but the cost would be immense. All alternative versions would cease to exist. Including most versions of the research team, Dr. Chen's many iterations began to merge into one definitive version, her consciousness finally unifying after decades of fragmentation. She explained that my unique position in the timeline made me the only one who could choose which reality would become the prime timeline. Time itself seemed to hold its breath as the moment of decision approached. The Thai food in my bag had become a temporal catalyst, its quantum state perfectly aligned for the collapse. Every version of every person trapped in the building turned to me, their existence hanging on my choice. The mainframe screens displayed the cascading probabilities, which timeline would survive, which versions would persist, and which would fade into quantum impossibility. Dr. Chen's unified form stood before me, offering one final revelation. The building wasn't just a failed experiment, it was a glimpse of reality's true nature, where all possibilities exist simultaneously until observed and collapsed into a single outcome. In the final seconds before I had to make my choice, the temporal energy reached its peak. The walls between realities became tissue-thin, and I could see every possible version of this moment playing out simultaneously. The trapped souls began to fade as timelines collapsed, their existence depending on which reality I would anchor to. With a clarity that cut through the quantum chaos, I understood that the delivery app on my phone had become a temporal tuning fork, its connection to the present reality, the only thing preventing complete temporal dissolution. As I made my decision, the quantum mainframe pulsed one final time, and reality itself held its breath, waiting to see which version of truth would become permanent, and which would fade into the realm of quantum possibilities never realized. The fluorescent lights in St. Peter's Memorial Hospital always seemed particularly harsh during the midnight shift. I've been working these halls for the past 3 years, but something about tonight felt different. The usual quiet was replaced by an unsettling stillness that made every footstep echo a little too loudly against the worn linoleum floors. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is my story, one I still struggled to believe, even though I lived through every moment of it. That night started like any other, with me checking on my regular patients in the East Wing. Room 407 housed our newest resident, Mr. Charles Winston, an 87-year-old man admitted for dementia and declining health. He was a frail figure with paper-thin skin and eyes that seemed to hold secrets from another time. I remember checking his vitals at 11:45 p.m., noting how peacefully he slept, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm beneath the standard-issue hospital blanket. At midnight, I was making my rounds in the West Wing when movement caught my eye in room 312. Through the half-open door, I saw an elderly man sitting in the visitor's chair, staring out the window. My heart nearly stopped. It was Mr. Winston, wearing the same blue hospital gown I had seen him in just 15 minutes ago, 3 floors up and in another wing. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. But when I opened my eyes, he was still there, now turning to face me with a knowing smile. I rushed back to room 407, my shoes squeaking against the floor as I ran. My hands were shaking as I pushed open the door, and there he was, Mr. Winston, sound asleep in his bed, exactly as I had left him. The monitor showed his steady heartbeat, unchanged. I stood there, frozen, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. The man I saw in room 312 couldn't have been him, but I couldn't shake the image of that smile, those eyes that seemed to recognize me. The rest of my shift was a blur of nervous energy and constant glances over my shoulder. I began noticing other small things I had overlooked before. The way the temperature would drop suddenly in certain corridors, how the lights would flicker ever so slightly when I passed specific rooms, but nothing prepared me for what happened at 3 a.m. while updating charts at the nurses' station. I glanced up at one of the security monitors and felt my blood run cold. There, in the grainy black and white footage, Mr. Winston was walking down the corridor of the pediatric ward, his hospital gown billowing slightly as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I quickly pulled up Mr. Winston's patient records, searching for anything unusual in his history. What I found made my hands tremble. He had been admitted to St. Peter's once before, 60 years ago. As a young doctor, the circumstances of his departure were redacted, marked only with a cryptic note, "Incident in East Wing, case sealed." As I stared at the screen, the lights in the nurses' station began to flicker, and in their strobing effect, I could have sworn I saw a reflection in the computer screen. Mr. Winston standing right behind me, but when I spun around, I was alone. The only sound was the distant beeping of monitors and my own ragged breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Winston's story than what appeared in his redacted files. The next evening, I arrived at work early and made my way to the hospital's records room in the basement. The room was a maze of metal shelves filled with dusty files dating back to the hospital's founding in 1921. The air was thick with the musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories. As I searched through the archives, I discovered a pattern that made my skin crawl. Every 20 years, like clockwork, there had been reports of strange occurrences in the hospital, patients appearing in multiple places, unexplained equipment malfunctions, and mysterious drops in temperature. Each incident coincided with the admission of an elderly patient who had some previous connection to St. Peter's. But the most disturbing part was how these cases were documented, with the same red stamp reading "Case Sealed" that I had seen on Mr. Winston's file. While I was absorbed in my research, I heard the shuffle of feet behind me. Margaret Blackwood, a retired nurse who had worked at St. Peter's for over 40 years, now volunteered in the hospital's library. Her eyes widened when she saw the files spread across the table. "You've seen him too, haven't you?" she whispered, pulling up a chair. "The old man who appears in different places." Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. "I've been keeping this for decades, waiting for someone else to notice." Margaret's journal contained detailed accounts of experiments conducted in the hospital's East Wing during the 1960s. The entries described a group of doctors, led by a younger Charles Winston, who were obsessed with finding a way to extend human life. They believed they had discovered something in the land beneath the hospital, something that the indigenous people who once lived here had considered sacred and dangerous. And the experiment started small, but grew increasingly sinister as their obsession deepened. The most chilling entry was dated June 15th, 1964. Margaret had witnessed Dr. Winston and his colleagues performing some kind of ritual in the hospital's old morgue. She described symbols drawn on the floor, strange chanting, and a darkness that seemed to move with a life of its own. The next day, 5 patients vanished without a trace, and Dr. Winston resigned unexpectedly. The case was sealed. The morgue was permanently closed, and the hospital administration acted as if nothing had happened. As I read the final pages of Margaret's journal, the lights in the records room began to flicker. Through the gaps between the shelves, I caught glimpses of movement, a familiar figure in a blue hospital gown, moving in impossible ways. Margaret grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "He's not just appearing in different places," she whispered urgently. "He's appearing in different times, and he's been waiting for someone to understand what he started all those years ago. The question is, why you? Why now?" The discovery of Margaret's journal set me on a path I couldn't turn back from. During my research, I found references to an ancient ritual the indigenous people used to communicate with their ancestors through sacred sites that now lay beneath the hospital's foundation. Dr. Winston hadn't just stumbled upon this knowledge, he had deliberately sought it out, twisting its purpose for his own dark ambitions. In the hospital's archived blueprints, I discovered that the old morgue was built directly over one of these sacred sites. The symbols Margaret had described in her journal matched ancient markings I found documented in anthropological studies of the area. But what caught my attention was a pattern. The symbols formed a perfect overlap with the locations where I had been seeing Mr. Winston appear. Each spot marked a thin point between time periods, like tears in the fabric of reality. That night, as I made my rounds, I found myself drawn to the sealed morgue entrance in the basement. The door had been welded shut decades ago, but there was a small observation window still accessible. As I shone my flashlight through the dusty glass, my breath caught in my throat. The beam illuminated faint traces of those same symbols on the floor, their edges still visible despite years of neglect. And there, in the center of the room, stood Mr. Winston, both as the elderly patient I knew and, somehow simultaneously, as the young doctor he had once been, using Margaret's journal as a guide. I began to understand the true nature of the ritual. Dr. Winston hadn't just been trying to extend life. He had been attempting to exist in multiple time frames simultaneously. The 5 missing patients hadn't vanished. They had been sacrificed to power the ritual, but something had gone wrong. Instead of achieving immortality, he had become fractured across time. his consciousness splintering between his past and present selves. The most terrifying realization came when I discovered my own connection to everything. In a photo from 1964, I saw a nurse who could have been my twin. The name on the back read Sarah Mitchell, my grandmother, who had disappeared during her shift at St. Peter's, the same night as Dr. Winston's ritual. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been randomly chosen to witness these events. I was part of them, connected by blood to the very ritual that had torn apart the barriers between times. Late that night, as I processed everything I had learned, the hospital's power suddenly failed. In the emergency lighting, I saw dozens of Mr. Winstons, each from a different point in time, all moving through the corridors like a macabre parade. They were converging on the old morgue, and as I watched, I realized with horror that they were recreating the ritual. Only this time, they were trying to complete what had been interrupted 60 years ago. And somehow, I knew I was meant to play a crucial role in their plans. The truth about my grandmother's disappearance changed everything. As I dug deeper into hospital records, I found a series of letters she had hidden in the walls of the old nurses' quarters. They detailed her discovery of Dr. Winston's plans and her desperate attempts to stop him. The final letter, dated the day she vanished, revealed that she had learned the true cost of the immortality ritual. It required the sacrifice of someone with a deep connection to time itself. Someone whose bloodline was intertwined with the ancient powers sleeping beneath the hospital. In my grandmother's last letter, she described a horrifying revelation. Our family line had been chosen generations ago by the indigenous healers as guardians of the temporal boundaries. We were born with the ability to sense disturbances in time, explaining why I could see Mr. Winston's multiple manifestations while others remained oblivious. Dr. Winston had discovered this secret and had specifically targeted my grandmother for his ritual. But something had gone wrong. Instead of completing the ceremony, she had managed to disrupt it at the cost of her own existence. The hospital's night shift became increasingly dangerous as Mr. Winston's various temporal versions grew more aggressive in their attempts to interact with me. They would appear in mirrors, speaking in riddles about completing what was started. Medical equipment would malfunction in my presence, displaying readings from different decades. Even the patients began reporting dreams of a young doctor performing strange ceremonies in the basement, all while an elderly version of himself watched from the shadows. During one particularly harrowing night shift, I found myself cornered in the pharmacy by 3 different versions of Mr. Winston. The youngest version, still wearing his doctor's coat from the 1960s, spoke about the nobility of his quest for immortality. The middle-aged version begged for help in undoing what he had done, but it was the current elderly Mr. Winston who terrified me most. He simply smiled, knowing that everything was proceeding exactly as planned across all timelines. I discovered that my grandmother hadn't just disappeared. She had become trapped between time frames. Her essence used to maintain the unstable temporal connections Dr. Winston had created through the fractured manifestations of time throughout the hospital. I could sometimes hear her voice warning me. She revealed that Dr. Winston's apparent success in appearing across multiple times was actually a curse. Each manifestation representing a fragment of his splintered soul, trying desperately to become whole again. That night, as I was documenting these revelations in my own journal, the entire hospital seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy I had come to associate with temporal disturbances. Through the windows, I could see that the outside world had become completely still. No movement, no sound, as if time itself had stopped. In that moment of unnatural silence, I received a page to room 407. The number on the pager display kept shifting between different years, and I knew that the time had come for the final confrontation, one that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of all the souls trapped in Dr. Winston's twisted experiment. The elevator to the 4th floor moved like it was swimming through molasses. Time itself seemed to resist my journey to room 407, where I knew everything would end, or perhaps begin. The digital display flickered between floor numbers and years. 2 1964 to 3 1982 4. When the doors finally opened, The corridor ahead rippled with temporal distortions, showing me glimpses of every version of this hospital that had ever existed or would exist. Mr. Winston, in his current elderly form, sat waiting in his bed when I entered room 407, but he wasn't alone. Standing at each corner of the room were his other selves, the ambitious young doctor from 1964, the haunted middle-aged man from 1982, and a version I hadn't seen before, somehow older than his present self, skin like ancient parchment and eyes burning with triumph. They had been waiting for this moment across decades, each version playing its part in an elaborate trap that had taken 60 years to spring. The Mitchell women have always been special. The eldest Winston spoke, his voice carrying echoes of all his other selves. Your grandmother understood what she was, what you are. Time doesn't flow through your bloodline. It eddies and pools. He gestured to the center of the room, where reality seemed to fold in on itself. Through that impossible distortion, I saw her, my grandmother, suspended in the moment of her sacrifice, eternally young and eternally dying. She thought she was stopping us, but she only delayed the inevitable. Her sacrifice created the very conjunction we needed. The younger Winstons began a chant in a language that predated the hospital, predated the town itself. Symbols hidden beneath the floor tiles ignited with an eerie blue light, forming a pattern I recognized from Margaret's journal. But now I could see what the journal hadn't shown, how the pattern extended beyond the room, beyond the hospital, connecting to ley lines that pulsed beneath the earth like temporal arteries. Your grandmother's sacrifice was the key, the young doctor, Winston explained, his face flushed with the fervor of a true believer. But to unlock the door, we need another Mitchell woman to complete the circuit. Imagine it, Sarah. Existence in all moments simultaneously. No more death, no more loss. Time itself would become our playground. He stepped forward, offering his hand. Join us willingly and we can save her. Resist, and we'll take what we need anyway. The temperature in the room plummeted as temporal energy gathered like a storm. Through the windows I could see the outside world freezing in place. Cars stopping mid-motion, birds hanging suspended in flight, even the digital clock on the wall cycling randomly through decades. My grandmother's suspended form began to flicker and solidify, her eyes meeting mine with desperate intensity. In that connection, I finally understood the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The ritual didn't just require Mitchell blood. It required a Mitchell woman's understanding of time's true nature. My grandmother hadn't failed to stop the ritual. She had transformed it, using her sacrifice to create a temporal lock that could only be unlocked by another Mitchell woman, not to complete Dr. Winston's blasphemous ceremony, but to undo it entirely. Every version of Winston that now existed was a fracture in time, an anomaly that needed to be corrected, and I was the only one who could do it. I stepped into the center of the room, my presence completing the circuit my grandmother had started 60 years ago. The Winstons realized their mistake too late. The symbols beneath the floor flared, not with the blue light of their corrupted ritual, but with a pure white radiance that came from somewhere far deeper than the hospital's foundations. My grandmother's form fully materialized beside me, no longer trapped between moments, but fully present in this one crucial instant. No, the eldest Winston screamed, his voice fracturing across all his iterations. You'll destroy everything we've worked for. The younger versions tried to grab me, but they passed through my form like smoke. The ritual wasn't just ending, it was reversing, pulling every splintered piece of Charles Winston back to its proper place in time. The walls of room 407 became transparent, showing the hospital as it existed across decades, each timeline burning away like old film until only the present remained. When it was over, only the current. Mr. Winston remained, lying peacefully in his bed. The monitors showed his heartbeat slowing, not from any supernatural cause, but simply because his natural time had finally come. My grandmother's form lingered for a moment longer, solid enough to press something into my hand. Her old nursing badge, still gleaming after 60 years. The hospital will always need a Mitchell, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations. Time needs its guardians. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I pinned my grandmother's badge next to my own. The symbols beneath the floor had faded, but I could still feel them thrumming with ancient power. The hospital would go on, and within its walls, time would continue to flow as it should. But now I understood my true role, not just as a nurse who tended to the sick, but as a guardian who maintained the delicate boundary between what was, what is, and what must never be. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the empty hallways of Riverdale High as I made my nightly rounds. 20 years of working as a janitor here had taught me every creak, every groan of this old building. But tonight felt different. The bitter Idaho wind howled outside, rattling the windows with an unusual ferocity, as if trying to warn me of something I couldn't yet understand. I pulled my cart down the science wing, the squeaking wheels echoing through the deserted corridor. My routine was always the same: clean the bathrooms, mop the floors, empty the trash, and wipe down the boards. Simple, predictable work that had become as natural as breathing. The solitude never bothered me. In fact, I'd grown to prefer it over the chaos of daytime hours. But tonight, the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Room 237 was my first stop. As always, the moment I pushed open the door, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs. Despite the heating system running at full blast, the beam from my flashlight swept across the room, illuminating rows of empty desks before landing on the whiteboard. My heart nearly stopped there, written in precise, elegant handwriting were the words, "Please help me, she's coming." My hands trembled as I reached for the eraser. I'd seen plenty of student pranks over the years, but something about this felt wrong. The writing was too neat, too deliberate, and the marker tray was completely empty. I quickly wiped away the message. The squeak of the eraser unusually loud in the empty classroom, but as I turned to leave, a soft scratching sound made me freeze. Slowly I looked back at the board. The message was reappearing, letter by letter, as if an invisible hand were writing it. But this time there was more. "Please help me. She's coming, room 108. The truth is buried there." I stumbled backward, my cart clattering against a desk. 20 years of routine had not prepared me for this. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. A student with invisible ink, a clever projection system, anything but what my eyes were telling me. In all my years at Riverdale High, I'd heard whispers about room 108. It had been sealed off since before I started working here, supposedly due to asbestos contamination. But now, staring at those words materializing before me, I knew there was something else, something darker. The comfortable predictability of my night shift had just shattered, and I was about to discover that some things are better left buried in the past. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of those ghostly words. Instead of going home after my shift, I found myself in the school's dusty archives, buried deep in the basement. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had always given me access, appreciating how I kept her domain spotless. Today, that trust would prove invaluable as I pulled out boxes of old records, searching for anything related to room 108. The yellowed newspapers and faded photographs told a story that made my blood run cold. In 1987, a 16-year-old student named Sarah Mitchell had vanished without a trace. The last place she was seen, room 108. The official report claimed she had run away, but as I dug deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. Sarah had been a straight-A student, involved in numerous clubs, with plans to attend Yale. None of her belongings were missing, and her locker remained untouched. My hands shook as I uncovered a photograph from the 1987 yearbook. Sarah's smile beamed up at me, hauntingly familiar, but it was the background of the photo that caught my attention. She was standing in front of room 108, and behind her, barely visible in the window reflection, was a dark figure I couldn't quite make out. The temperature in the archives seemed to drop as I noticed something even more disturbing. Sarah's handwriting on a class assignment matched perfectly with the mysterious messages on the board. The sound of footsteps above made me jump. Through the ceiling, I could hear the early arrival of teachers and staff. But something was off about these footsteps. They seemed to be pacing, back and forth, directly over room 108. I checked my watch. 5:47 a.m. Far too early for anyone else to be here. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like scratching, as if someone or something was trying to claw through the floor. Deep in the box of records, I found a maintenance report from 1987, dated just days after Sarah's disappearance. It detailed the immediate closure of room 108 due to structural concerns. Not asbestos, as we'd been told. The report was signed by Principal Matthews, who still ran the school. But what caught my eye was a handwritten note in the margin. Keep them away from the walls. They must never know what's inside. The lights in the archives flickered, and in the momentary darkness, I swore I heard a whisper. Find me. When the lights stabilized, every paper on the table had been rearranged, forming two words that made my heart stop. Dig deeper that night. I returned to room 237 with newfound purpose. The messages had started here, and something told me this room held more secrets than just ghostly writing on boards. As I entered, my flashlight beam caught something I'd never noticed before. Tiny scratches in the floor leading to the back wall. They looked like desperate fingernail marks. Trailing off beneath the baseboards, the temperature plummeted as I approached the wall, my breath visible in the beam of light. The scratches seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, barely perceptible in the darkness. I ran my fingers along the baseboards and felt a slight draft. Impossible. Given that this was an interior wall, pulling out my utility knife, I carefully pried away the baseboard, revealing a small cavity behind the wall. Inside was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. The diary belonged to Sarah Mitchell, and its contents were devastating. She discovered something sinister happening at Riverdale High. Systematic abuse of power, missing students swept under the rug, and experiments conducted in the basement beneath room 108. The final entry was dated the day she disappeared. They know I found the files. Principal Matthews cornered me today, said we needed to discuss my future. Meeting him in room 108 after school if anything happens to me. The truth is in the walls. A sudden bang made me whirl around. The classroom door had slammed shut, and the temperature dropped even further. On the board, words began appearing rapidly. You're getting closer, but be careful. They're watching. They never left. Check the old photography lab. The handwriting matched Sarah's diary perfectly. As I watched, droplets of water began running down the board, freezing into ice crystals that spelled out another message. Time is running out. The sound of keys jingling in the hallway sent me into a panic. I quickly replaced the baseboard, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, a figure stood watching me, a young girl in dated clothing, her form translucent and flickering like an old film projection. She raised a finger to her lips, then pointed to the floor. Where she pointed, the linoleum tiles seemed to shift, revealing a Polaroid photograph underneath, with trembling hands. I retrieved the photo. It showed room 108 from 1987, but not the version we knew. In the image, the room extended far below the ground level, with strange equipment lining the walls and what looked like holding cells in the background. But most disturbing was the group of faculty members in the photo. Principal Matthews among them, all wearing ceremonial robes and standing around a strange symbol etched into the floor. The same symbol I'd seen scratched into the margins of Sarah's diary. The photography lab was exactly where Sarah's ghost had directed me. In the school's condemned east wing, the lock was ancient, but my master key still worked. Inside, decades of dust covered everything, except for one cabinet that looked recently disturbed. My flashlight revealed hundreds of development trays, chemical bottles, and contact sheets. But it was the red safe light that caught my attention. It was on, despite the power being cut to this section years ago. Under the blood-red glow, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath the developing sink. Inside were dozens of photographs documenting unspeakable rituals in room 108. Each image showed students in various states of distress, surrounded by robed figures. The dates spanned decades, long before and after Sarah's disappearance. But it was the most recent photo that made my blood freeze. Dated just last week, showing Principal Matthews performing the same ritual, unchanged since 1987. A noise from the darkroom door made me spin around. Principal Matthews stood there, looking exactly as he had in the 1987 photograph. "Curious about our extracurricular activities, Thomas?" he asked, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo. Behind him I could see more robed figures emerging from the shadows. "We've been watching you." Sarah was curious too. Look where that got her. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath crystallizing in the air. The red safe light began to flicker violently, and in the strobing darkness, I saw something impossible. The robed figures weren't casting shadows. They were shadows, their forms rippling and writhing like smoke. Principal Matthews smiled, but his teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too numerous. The rituals must continue. "Thomas, the hunger must be fed. Why do you think this school has had perfect test scores for decades? Perfect attendance, perfect discipline?" I backed away, clutching the damning photographs. Through the windows I could see more shadow figures gliding across the school grounds, converging on the building. Matthews stepped forward, his form beginning to distort. "Every 20 years, we need a new custodian, someone to tend to the hungry ones beneath." Sarah refused. "But you, Thomas, you've already been here for 2 decades. You're perfect." Suddenly, the ghost of Sarah appeared between us, her form more solid than I'd ever seen it. "Run!" she screamed, and the temperature dropped so low that the pipes burst, spraying freezing water everywhere. In the chaos, I bolted past Matthews, whose inhuman scream followed me through the corridors. As I ran, every locker burst open, releasing decades of accumulated darkness. Behind me, I could hear thousands of whispers, the voices of every student who had ever disappeared at Riverdale High. I fled to the one place I knew they wouldn't expect. Room 108 itself. The sealed door gave way easily under my shoulder, revealing a room that had waited 30 years for this moment. The air was thick with decay and something else, an electric charge that made my skin crawl in the beam of my flashlight. I saw that the floor was covered in hundreds of messages, all in different handwritings, all begging for help. They were the voices of the disappeared, carved directly into the floorboards. The ritual circle from the photographs was still there, its strange symbols pulsing with a sickly green light. As I stepped closer, the floor began to crack, revealing a bottomless void beneath. From its depths came a sound, not crying or screaming, but singing, a horrible, beautiful chorus of voices that made my mind twist in impossible ways. I recognized Sarah's voice among them, but also hundreds of others, all singing about the hunger that lived beneath Riverdale High. Principal Matthews and his shadow congregation burst into the room, their forms now completely inhuman, twisted masses of darkness with too many eyes and too many mouths. "You don't understand, Thomas," Matthews spoke, his voice layered with countless others. "This school, this town, it all exists because of what we feed below. Every 20 years it needs a new guardian, someone to tend to its hunger, to choose the worthy sacrifices. Sarah would have been perfect, but she fought us. You've already proven yourself. 20 years of loyal service." The void beneath the ritual circle began to widen, and I could feel it pulling at my soul. But then Sarah appeared again, this time accompanied by dozens of other spectral figures. All the missing students from across the decades, they formed a circle around me, their combined presence pushing back the darkness. "The only way to end this," Sarah's ghost whispered, "is to close the gate, but it requires a willing sacrifice, someone to take the place of all those lost." In that moment, I understood why I'd been drawn to this job, to this school, for so many years. Maybe I had always been meant to end this. I looked at my reflection in the cracked window and saw myself as I truly was for the first time. I hadn't aged a day since I started working here. I wasn't just the custodian. I was the first sacrifice from the very first ritual, kept alive and unaging by the same dark force that had claimed so many others. Principal Matthews lunged forward, but he was too late. I stepped into the ritual circle and began the incantation I somehow had always known. The symbols flared blindingly bright as I spoke the words that would end it all. The void began to close, pulling the shadows, the darkness, and the hungry thing beneath with it. The last thing I saw was Sarah's smile, no longer sad but triumphant, as the void collapsed. Taking me with it, I heard her final whisper. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw those footprints. The pristine Montana snow lay untouched around my farmhouse that December morning, except for a single trail of prints leading away from my back door. They started right at the threshold, not leading to it, but from it. Perfect impressions of bare feet in the deep snow, as if someone had materialized inside my house and walked out. I've been a photographer long enough to trust my eyes, to believe what I see through the lens, but this defied logic. I followed the tracks with my gaze, watching them stretch across my backyard before disappearing into the dense tree line of the forest. The morning sun cast long shadows through the bare branches, creating a lattice of darkness on the snow surface. Each print was crisp, deliberate, showing no signs of stumbling or hesitation, despite being made by bare feet in below freezing temperatures. The isolation that had once brought me comfort now felt suffocating. 3 months I'd been here, seeking refuge from the chaos of city life and the weight of memories I couldn't shake. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain road, and cell service was spotty at best. I'd chosen this place precisely because it was cut off from the world. Now that decision felt like a noose tightening around my neck. My security cameras had captured nothing during the night. I checked and rechecked the footage until my eyes burned, but there was no movement, no figure emerging from my house. The prints simply appeared between the 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. timestamps, as if the snow itself had decided to hold the impression of something impossible. The rational part of my brain searched for explanations. Maybe I was sleepwalking, maybe an animal had somehow made tracks that only looked human. Inside the house, nothing was disturbed. Every door remained locked, every window secured against the bitter Montana winter. I went room by room, camera in hand, documenting everything with the methodical precision that had made me successful in my career. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I found myself holding my breath at each sound, straining to hear anything unusual in the old farmhouse's usual symphony of settling wood and whistling wind. It wasn't until I reached my dark room in the basement that I noticed something off. The chemical smell of developer was stronger than it should have been, and one of my drying lines had been disturbed. A single photograph was missing, one I'd developed the night before. I could still see the wet marks on the concrete floor where it had dripped. But what chilled me more than the theft was the realization that I couldn't remember what image had been on that missing photograph. Try as I might, the memory slipped away like smoke through my fingers. The walls seemed to breathe that night. I sat in my living room, every light blazing against the darkness, listening to the subtle shifts and groans of the house. What had once been the normal sounds of an old building now carried sinister undertones. The scratching inside the walls could have been mice, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful. It followed me from room to room, always staying just on the other side of the plaster. Sleep was impossible, so I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. The previous owner had left behind boxes of documents in the attic. Deeds, repairs records, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. As I sifted through them, a pattern began to emerge. Every decade or so, someone would disappear from the property. The official reports cited mountain lions, exposure to the elements, or simple abandonment. But the handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. The original builder, Thomas Blackwood, had constructed the house in 1892 using lumber from the surrounding forest. The trees here were ancient, predating European settlement, and local Native American tribes had considered the area cursed. Blackwood's journal entries became increasingly erratic as construction progressed. He wrote about voices in the wood, about the lumber that seemed to shift and move even after being nailed in place. His final entry simply read, "They're in the walls now. They've always been in the walls." A loud thump from inside the nearest wall made me jump, scattering papers across the attic floor. When I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, I could have sworn I heard whispers, not the hiss of pipes or the scurry of vermin, but actual words just below the threshold of comprehension. The temperature around me plummeted, and my breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. Something scraped against the other side of the wall. Like fingernails on wood, the documents revealed that the house had been built over the remains of an older structure, one that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. But it was a photo at the bottom of the box that made my blood run cold. A faded sepia image of the original homestead. There, in one of the windows, was a face I recognized, not from the 1800s, but from my own missing photograph that had disappeared from the darkroom. As I stared at the image, trying to make sense of the impossible, the scratching in the walls grew louder. It was coming from all around me now, a cacophony of scraping and whispering that seemed to pulse in sync with my racing heart. The attic suddenly felt like a trap, and as I turned to leave, I saw them. Bare footprints appearing one by one in the dust of the floor, leading straight toward me from the darkest corner of the room. The local library in town was a small affair, but its archives held secrets darker than I could have imagined. Missing persons reports dating back over a century, all connected to my property or the surrounding woods. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Footprints leading away from buildings, never toward them. The townspeople had a name for it, the backward walker. They spoke of it in whispers. If they spoke of it at all, Mrs. Henderson, the ancient librarian with eyes like clouded glass, recognized my address immediately. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a leather-bound journal from a locked drawer in her desk. "My grandmother wrote this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was there when they found what was left of the Blackwood family. The journal told of indigenous warnings about hollow people who lived in the ancient trees, entities that could slip between the spaces in wooden walls and wear human shells like clothing. The construction of my house coincided with a series of devastating logging operations in the late 1800s. The lumber company had disturbed something in the deep woods, something that followed the harvested trees back to civilization. The journal described how the entities would choose a house, infesting its walls like termites, before selecting their victims. They always took people who were alone, isolated, vulnerable. People like me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't chosen this house by accident. It had chosen me. Local law enforcement records showed a bizarre detail that had been overlooked. Every victim had recently developed their own photographs before disappearing. The chemicals used in photo development apparently attracted these entities, drawing them out of the wood. My darkroom, my photographs, the missing print, everything connected with terrible clarity. The entities weren't just taking people, they were collecting moments, stealing fragments of time captured on film. I found news clippings about the previous owner of my house, a reclusive artist who had vanished 3 years ago. The police had found his studio filled with paintings of distorted figures emerging from walls, their bodies twisted impossibly between wooden boards on the back of each canvas. He had written the same message over and over. They show you what you've forgotten before they take you. I thought about my missing photograph, about the memory that slipped away with it. That's when Mrs. Henderson showed me the final piece of evidence, a photograph taken of my property in 1979. It showed a figure standing in my bedroom window, but the figure was me, wearing the exact clothes I had on at that moment. The image was decades old, yet there I was, staring out at the photographer with eyes that knew too much. As I looked closer, I noticed something even more terrifying. My reflection in the window showed a different face, one made of knots and whorls in the wood grain of the wall behind me. The hidden passages inside my walls weren't built by human hands. I discovered the first one behind my bedroom closet, a space that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, like an optical illusion made solid. The wood grain of the boards flowed like water, forming patterns that drew the eye inward, promising secrets in their depths. I knew I should run, should leave this cursed house behind, but the walls had been calling my name, using voices I thought I'd never hear again. My brother's voice was the first I recognized, echoing from deep within the twisting passages. Michael had disappeared 20 years ago. When we were both children, the official report said he had wandered into the woods and gotten lost. But I remembered differently. I remembered the bare footprints leading away from our childhood home, and the way the wooden walls had whispered the night before he vanished. Our parents had dismissed my stories as trauma-induced delusions. Now, 2 decades later, I was hearing his voice again, calling me deeper into the impossible spaces between the walls. Armed with only my camera and a flashlight, I forced myself into the first passage. The wood seemed to breathe around me, expanding and contracting like lungs made of timber. The deeper I went, the more the passages resembled a forest, not of living trees, but of processed lumber that had somehow retained its vital essence. Photographs lined these organic corridors, thousands of them, showing moments stolen from countless lives. I recognized some faces from the missing persons reports, each frozen in expressions of dawning horror. My missing photograph was there, pinned to a knot in the wood that pulsed like a heart. The image showed something I had completely forgotten. A moment from the night before I found the first footprints. I was sleeping in my bed, but a figure stood over me. Its body a fluid mixture of shadow and wood grain. It was touching my forehead with fingers made of splinters, and I could now remember the dreams it had planted, the compulsions it had seeded that had drawn me to this house. The walls of the passage continued to shift, revealing more photographs from my past. Images I had taken throughout my career, but subtly wrong. In each one, lurking in the background, were the entities. They had been following me my entire life, guiding me here, waiting for me to be alone enough, broken enough, to finally take. My camera started clicking on its own, capturing the revelation in rapid bursts of light that illuminated things moving in the darkness ahead. Then I saw it. A door made entirely of photographs held together by living wood. Through its translucent surface, I could see a room beyond, and in that room was Michael, exactly as he had looked 20 years ago. He turned to face me, but his eyes were dark knots in wooden skin, and his smile was made of splinters. "Welcome home, sister," he said, his voice a rustling of dead leaves. "We've been waiting so long to show you what you've forgotten." The truth unfolded like a horrific photograph developing in toxic chemicals. These entities, these hollow people, hadn't just been collecting victims, they had been cultivating them. Every disappearance, every stolen moment captured on film was part of a larger pattern. They were creating a family album of sorts, preserving fragments of human lives within their wooden anatomy. And I, with my camera and my isolation, had been the perfect candidate to complete their collection. Michael's wooden face began to ripple, showing me memories I had suppressed. The night he disappeared, I had followed him into the walls of our childhood home. I had watched as the entities welcomed him, transformed him, made him part of their eternal forest. But they had sent me back, altered my memories, and planted the seeds of compulsion that would eventually lead me here. They needed me to grow up, to develop my photographer's eye, to learn how to capture moments that they could consume. The passage around me began to transform, the wooden walls, sprouting branches and leaves made of photographs. Each image showed a moment of choice, a split second where reality could have branched in different directions. The entities existed in these moments of possibility, feeding on the potential energy of lives that could have been. My camera had given them windows into these moments, letting them reach through time itself to pluck their chosen ones from the flow of history. I saw the truth about the house's original builder, Thomas Blackwood. He hadn't just built a house. He had constructed a portal using lumber from trees that had grown in soil, fertilized by centuries of indigenous sacrifices to keep the hollow people appeased when the logging company had cut down those ancient trees. They had released these entities into the wider world. Now they moved through all wooden structures like a slow-spreading infection, waiting for the perfect hosts to join their twisted family. My brother reached for me with hands that creaked like old floorboards. Behind him I could see others, all the missing people from the photographs, their bodies now hybrid things of flesh and lumber. They were smiling, welcoming, offering an eternity of preserved moments, an escape from the linear march of time. Part of me wanted to accept, to finally understand the mysteries I had been chasing my entire life. My camera clicked one final time, capturing the moment of choice. But in that last photograph, I saw what I would become. not just another victim, but a curator of their collection, drawing in more lonely souls with my images. The camera had always been their tool, and I had been their unwitting apprentice, with the last remnants of my humanity. I raised my flashlight and ignited the roll of film in my camera. The chemical fire spread rapidly through the organic passages, feeding on decades of stolen photographs. The walls began to scream, a sound like a forest in a hurricane, as their carefully preserved moments turned to ash, as the inferno consumed the house above. I ran through burning passages that collapsed behind me, leaving my brother and his wooden family to their fiery reunion with the forest that had birthed them. They say photographs capture souls. I now know that some souls were never meant to be captured, and some families are better left scattered through time than preserved in eternal stasis. I still take pictures, but only of things in motion, never of quiet moments that might hide something watching from within the walls. And I never, ever photograph wooden houses standing alone in the snow.